All right, this is Dr. Allen. In this section, we're going to talk about epithelial tissue. Here's your objectives. I'm not going to read through them, but essentially we're going to talk about the characteristics of epithelial, list the different types of them, and then we're going to talk about various glands that are made out of epithelial tissue. And when we talk about epithelial tissue, there's kind of four generic things that it can do. One is it'll cover the body surface, such as the skin. So wherever you see skin on your body, that's the top layer of that is called epithelial tissue or epithelium. It can line the inside of a body cavity, and we talked about those three body cavities before. You have your pleural cavity, you have your pericardium, the layer of the serosa surrounding the heart. Then you also have the abdominal cavity, the peritoneum. So that's serosa is a type of epithelial tissue. You can have an epithelium, sorry, I can't speak very well, lining the inside of an organ, such as inside of the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines. That's called a mucosa. And then epithelial tissue can also function as glands. So here's a general structure of epithelium. You see it right here. And that's this guy right here. So this is a microscopic view. Now, a couple of points here about microscopic views. When you're looking at these things, sometimes if you've never looked at these before, it could be perhaps a little confusing. But in general, when you're looking at these images, you can see that there's these little dark circles within the cells, and those are the nuclei of the cells. And in this case here, we have, let's just say this particular, let's see if I can change my setting here. So this thing right here is a single epithelial cell right there. Within that epithelial cell is a nucleus. That's the purple, the dark purple thing. The cytoplasm is this light pink stuff here. And then when you have a bunch of these cells put together, those is called a tissue. And in this case, epithelial tissue is this whole layer of epithelial cells that's covering something. And so you have two surfaces of an epithelial tissue. You have the apical surface and you have a basal surface. The apical surface is this top layer right here. Okay, and we'll just kind of go like this with my little marker here. This is the apical surface. This goes out to open space, which is kind of over here, right? So if it was your skin, this would be the environment. If this was the inside of a hollow organ, this would be like the inside of the organ. If this was a serosa, over here would be the organ with the other side of the serosa. Okay, that's the apical surface. Then you have what's called a basal surface. And that basal surface you can kind of see is, if you look, it's hard to really define on this image, but it kind of goes along like this, just like that. Basal means bottom or base. You can think of a, let's just say like a basement, right? It's the basement membrane that overlies the underlying connective tissue. We'll talk about connective tissue in a different lesson, but it's this kind of this stuff under here, the thing that's being coated, right? So you have your basal surface, you have your apical surface, you have your individual cells and the nuclei, and then the cytoplasm. On top of the apical surface, right here, this is an image, what we're looking at here, you can have these little hair-like particles, not particles, hair-like structures coming off the top, and that's called microvilli. You can kind of see, if you look closely enough here on this apical surface, this little fuzzy part right here, that's the microvilli on top of the epithelial cells. And this is a very, very close-up view of the microvilli here. You can kind of see they're just these little individual hair-like little things that kind of stick out. So now that we talked about the general characteristics of epithelial tissue, we need to classify it. And there's several different classifications of epithelium. And it's very important that you learn all of them because it's going to keep coming back throughout this semester and the next semester as well. So epithelial tissue. So it could either be classified as something called simple, meaning it has one cell layer, such as this example right here, just one cell layer. You can see here it's the basal surface is down here and the apical surface is up here on the top. That's a simple epithelium. You could also have what's called stratified. Stratified means that there's layers, right? Layers of the epithelial cells. So in this case here, you can see the layering of the cells. That's a stratified epithelium. Here's your basal surface down here at the bottom. And then the apical surface is up here on the top of this whole thing. And not in between here in these little, over these, between these cells, that's not the apical surface or the basal surface. It's just the bottom layer here by the basement membrane, and then the top layer here of the environment. So you can classify epithelium by whether it's simple or stratified, but then you also can classify it based on the shape of the cell. So there's three cell shapes that we worry about. One is squamous, and this is the flat cell. It looks like a fried egg. Oftentimes people will say that. Next is cuboidal, and it's called cuboidal because it looks like a cube. It's just basically kind of a square, and it's three-dimensional, right? So I guess the drawing in the book is probably better than my drawing, but you get the idea. It's cube-shaped. And then you have columnar, right? And it's like a column. So this is more of a rectangular shape, but three-dimensional, right? So squamous is flat, cuboidal is a square, and columnar is tall. So now I wanted to put this into practice, showing you different areas of the body that has these types of tissue. So the first one is simple squamous. Remember, simple just means that it has one layer, and squamous refers to the shape, that little flat cell. So simple squamous epithelium. Here's a drawing of it right here. That looks like that. And then here's an example of a microscopic view of a part of the lungs, the alveoli of the lungs. So you can see it's just this very, very thin layer of single cells, that flat cell. You can say the little purple dots are the nuclei, the pink stuff is the cytoplasm. And so when you hear simple squamous epithelium, think lungs. Now there's other things here, that it can contain, but for the sake of this lesson, just think of the lungs as an example of simple squamous epithelium. Next we have simple cuboidal. Remember, simple is one layer, and cuboidal is the shape of the cells. See how they look like little cubes. Where is this at? Well, it's a lot of it is in the renal system, right? So the tubes of the kidney, and then it's also part of the lining of ducts of various glands, and the surface of the ovaries as well. So when we see simple cuboidal microscopically, you can kind of see here this, right? And it's kind of in these little round shapes right here. And so let me go ahead and switch to a more finer detail, right? So here we have the basement membrane side, and then here we have the apical surface. And then contained like this are the different cuboidal cells, just like so. You can also kind of tell, here's a nice view of a little outline of the cell membrane in this little section right here. See that? This is the basement membrane side here. This is the apical surface here. Little dark spots are the nuclei. Then we have simple columnar. Remember, simple is one layer, and they're columnar because they're tall, like columns. Kind of this shape right here. Where is this? Most of this is in the digestive tract. So when you think of simple columnar epithelium, think of digestive tract. Here's a microscopic view here, where you have, this is the apical surface, and right along this little fuzzy edge right here, that's the microvilli. That's important for absorption of digested material. And then we can kind of see here the little outlines of each individual simple columnar epithelial cells, just like that. See that? It has a single nucleus in here. You see here there's like a couple of dark spots within that. Those are just multiple nucleoli within the nucleus. And then you have this thing right here, which is called a goblet cell. Goblet cell contains mucus. We'll talk about that here in a future slide. But these goblet cells are part of the small intestine mucosa. Then we have what's called pseudostratified columnar. Pseudo means false, right? So when you look at it under a microscope here, just like this, it kind of looks like it could be stratified with several layers. See how the nuclei are all kind of in different positions relative to one another? The other examples, it look like just kind of all the nuclei were at about the same level, but this looks like it might be stratified, but it's not. Each of these cells, you can kind of see this diagram here. There are various shapes and thicknesses. You can kind of see this one right here. It has this little, at the bottom is kind of narrow and at the top is kind of skinny. And then next to it, there's a bottom is skinny, fat. The bottom is skinny, the top is fat. And then one next to it, the bottom is kind of fat and the top part is skinny. That gives it that pseudo-stratified, that false appearance of being stratified. Where is that located? Upper respiratory tract, trachea, and then some other parts of the body. Excuse me. Again, here's that goblet cell. Kind of see it right here. This stuff right here, that's mucus that's within those goblet cells. And then we have finally this epithelium called transitional epithelium. It's transitional because sometimes it looks like a cube and sometimes it gets stretched out like a squamous cell. So transitional means it can vary its shape. But where is transitional epithelium? Well, it's primarily here in the urinary tract, specifically the ureters and the bladder. And why is that important? Well, because the bladder can be like this size, and all of a sudden you drink a bunch of water and it stretches out to being this size. And that's the urethra there. So the lining in there of the bladder has that flexibility to stretch out based on the size of the bladder, just like that. Transitional epithelium. The only time you'll see that really is in the bladder, ureters, and the urethra. Now let's talk about stratified epithelium. We have stratified squamous. Remember the squamous cells are those kind of those thin cells. They look like maybe fried eggs. You can kind of see here this how it's stratified and they're squamous because they're all flat like that. Where do you see stratified squamous? You'll see it in a lot of areas. It depends on if there's keratin or not. But if it's not keratinized, which this example is, you'll see it inside of the mouth, inside of the vagina, and then maybe some other structures inside of the body. Keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, keratinized, is that which you find on the skin. Right? So keratin, that's this part over here. Keratin is just it's like a protein substance that's created by the epithelial cells, which are these cells down here. We'll learn more about that when we get to the integumentary system. But keratin is just basically dead skin cells, but it acts as a barrier to keep water out, to keep water in, and then a little bit of protection as well for your skin. We'll talk about that more later on, but that's keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. You don't necessarily have that in your mouth. Some sections of the inside of your mouth will have it, but and then some sections elsewhere in the body that are kind of inside of the body, but For the most part, this is external tissue. Okay, so now let's talk about glands. Um, the glands, they don't necessarily cover the surface of structures, kind of like the epithelium we had been talking about previously. But glands, there's two types of glands. We have endocrine glands and we have exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are like the adrenal gland that makes adrenaline, the thyroid gland, pituitary gland that creates substances that gets distributed throughout the body through the bloodstream, as an example. We're not going to talk about that today. We'll save that for a later unit when we get to the endocrine system. So we'll just kind of scratch that out for now. They are glands, but for this purpose, we're going to talk about these exocrine glands. And these are these smaller glands that act locally, depending on where they're where they are and what their function is. So there's two types. You can have unicellular glands, right? It's made of one cell. So here's an example of a unicellular gland, which is that goblet cell. Secretes mucus. This is a pseudostratified columnar epithelium within the trachea here. Multicellular glands kind of look like this right here. You see that? Or this one right here. So this is the actual gland composed of many, many cells, and they work together to make a particular product that gets secreted out of the gland and to do something locally. So there's different functions of that secretion. There's merocrine and then there's holocrine. Okay. This here talks about apocrine, but we don't need to worry about that. What I want to talk about here mostly is the holocrine secretion and then the merocrine secretion and what's the difference between the two. So getting to the more specific glands, unicellular glands we said was a goblet cell, produces this substance called mucin. Mucin is a glycoprotein. Remember I told you glycoproteins was a mixture of protein and sugar. When mucin dissolves in water, it creates this substance called mucus. I think we've all heard of mucus, especially in the respiratory tract. But here's kind of a nice pretty picture of a goblet cell. It's got different colors, but it's a one cell gland, and it has these secretory vesicles that contain this mucin substance that gets secreted out here. So if this is the respiratory tract, that's how mucus gets created, like in your nose and in your sinuses and in kind of down your trachea. Now, multicellular glands can be classified based on their structure. So we can have these right here, which is a simple duct structure. And you can have this one here, which is a compound duct structure. Here's your very basic gland here, simple tubular gland, because this is tubular structure here. Right? So it's a simple tubular. This is what's in the intestines, these simple tubular glands. You can have simple branch tubular, like that. So you can see the little branches, but they're relatively simple. And this could be in the stomach, your stomach glands, your gastric glands. Then you can have what's called compound tubular, where you see compared to this simple tubular compound, you have multiple little tubular structures coming out, branching, much more complex compared to the simple version. This would be in the glands of the small intestine, would look like that. Now you could also have the structure, instead of a tubular structure, you can have what's called an alveolar structure. The difference is the length, right? So a tubular structure would be more elongated, like so, but these are alveolar in shape. So you have a simple alveolar, but in humans, there's really not a good example of that, so you don't need to worry about that. But you can have a simple branched alveolar gland, and these are called sebaceous glands or oil glands in the skin. And then you have compound alveolar, remember, because this is a little more complex, but instead of being tube-shaped, like the other example we had, these are alveolar shaped, just kind of more little sacs, like little grapes, clusters of grapes. So example, that could be the mammary glands. And then you have this mixture, tubo-alveolar. See, some are more tube-like and some are more grape-like. An example of that would be in the salivary glands. And then finally, I had mentioned, there's merocrine glands and there's holocrine glands. Merocrine glands are those that will secrete their substance by a process of exocytosis, right? So the actual cells themselves kind of stay intact, and it just kind of releases the little whatever the product is into this little gland structure, and then it goes up through this way and exits out of the gland to do whatever function it is. Okay, so some examples that are glands that occur in the pancreas, sweat glands, and then salivary glands kind of act like that. Holocrine glands, a little bit different, where the entire cell will rupture, releasing not only the secretion but also dead cell fragments. See right here. So chunks of the cell kind of get, released along with the whole process to do whatever function it is. Now, an example of that is the sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands are the oil glands of the skin, and if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, right? So these secretions in the sebaceous glands, they have these little fragments, and it's kind of oily, and um, can lead to various problems such as acne and that sort of thing. Okay, so that's it for epithelium or epithelial tissue. We shall see you for the next lesson.